The wind smelled of dust and feed as the army truck rumbled to a halt at the edge of a Texas ranch. A barbed wire fence gleamed in the heat. The women inside were silent. Japanese prisoners, tired, thin, their uniforms stiff with ocean salt and shame. They had been moved from camp to countryside, told they would work the land. Most braced for humiliation, but as the truck door opened, what came running toward them wasn't a soldier. It was a dog, big, golden, bounding with joy. One woman shrank back. Another stood frozen. The dog, sandy-furred and grinning, ignored the barking guard and nosed gently at their hands. When they were led to the bunkhouse, it followed. When they sat for dinner, it curled beside them. When one wept that night in her cot, the dog rested its head on her bunk. And when a guard tried to shoo it, the dog growled, not at the prisoners, but at the American. They had come to fear guns, but what disarmed them was loyalty. The truck swallowed the last of the road dust as it ground to a stop in front of a gate that looked too ordinary to be part of a war. Wooden posts leaned slightly, sun-warped, the wire stretched between them, slack with age, as if even the fence had grown tired of standing guard. Beyond it, fields rolled out like a painted backdrop, dry grass bending under a wide Texas sky that did not seem to care who had won or lost on the other side of the ocean. The women stepped down one by one, boots hitting gravel, shoulders stiff from weeks of transit, eyes trained to search for weapons, for anger, for the sharp edges of cruelty they had been promised would greet them. Their hands stayed close to their bodies, fingers curled as though bracing against an invisible blow. None came. No shouting, no spitting, no rifle butts raised, only the low murmur of cattle somewhere in the distance and the scrape of a man's boot against the dirt as he leaned on the fence to watch them arrive. And then there was the dog. He did not approach with caution or calculation. He did not circle them the way guard dogs did in propaganda films, teeth bared, ready to punish. He came running straight through the open gate as if it had never been meant to hold anything back in the first place. Ears loose, tail swinging wildly, tongue hanging out in a natural, careless grin. His paws kicked up dust as he ran, and that dust, light and harmless, settled on their shoes without asking permission. Several of the women flinched instinctively. One stepped back, heart hammering, expecting the sudden bite, the trained aggression. Another raised her arms awkwardly, a useless defense she had carried over from a world of drills and shouted orders, but the dog did not lunge. He slowed, he wagged, he lowered his head and sniffed the hem of a uniform as though inspecting a new and unfamiliar fabric rather than an enemy. He smelled like hay and sun. Behind the dog, the men of the ranch stood at a distance, not in a rigid military line, but scattered, leaning against posts, tobacco bulging in cheeks, hats tipped low over eyes, narrowed by both sunlight and curiosity. They did not rush forward. They did not bark commands. They let the silence do its work, as if observing some strange natural process rather than the arrival of prisoners. When one of the women looked up, trying to read hatred or triumph on their faces, she found neither. Only a kind of distant watchfulness, the kind reserved for animals brought in from a storm, unsure whether they would bolt or stay. The fence closed behind them with a muted rattle, not a sound of menace, just a sound of finality. They were led toward a low bunkhouse near the edge of the fields, its wood bleached by the sun and its porch sagging at one corner. Every step felt like crossing deeper into a place that refused to match the stories they had grown up with. There were no barking orders, no sharp boots echoing in unison. The men spoke little, and when they did, their voices carried none of the venom the women had learned to fear. just practical instructions about where to stand, where to leave their bags, when to eat, and the dog followed. He followed as though tethered to them by something unseen. Past the fence line, past the doorway of the bunkhouse, right up onto the worn boards of the porch where they were told to sit and wait. When a soldier nearby clucked his tongue to send him away, the dog ignored it completely, settling instead at the feet of the youngest woman, curling his body in a loose circle, his head dropping onto her boots as if he had chosen her deliberately. She froze. She did not dare to move her leg. Her entire life had trained her that contact with the enemy meant danger. That warmth from the other side was deception. But here was a warm, living weight against her foot, breathing slowly, its trust so absolute it almost frightened her. She had not been chosen for anything in months except survival. Now she was chosen as a resting place by a creature that seemed to know nothing of nationalities or shame. The other women watched, silent, some with disbelief, some with suspicion. One with trembling hands, reaching toward the fur and stopping just short, as if touching him would confirm a reality too strange to accept. The ranchers laughed softly, not at them, but at the dog, calling his name once more. Buddy. The sound of it floated across the yard, casual and affectionate. The word itself felt like another shock. In their world, dogs had been tools, guards, instruments of discipline. Here one had a name like a friend, like a child. The fences still stood. The uniforms still marked them. The distance between captor and captive remained, written in geography and power. But something had already shifted, not because of speeches, not because of promises, not because of leniency, but because a dusty ranch dog had run across a gate that meant nothing to him, and decided that these women, with their guarded eyes and trembling hands, belonged beside him now. His warmth against their boots did not dissolve their fear. It stirred it. It dragged it out of hiding, pulled it up from the marrow of their bones where it had been driven during long nights of drills and lectures, and whispered threats spoken by officers who never imagined this moment would actually arrive. They had been trained not just to fight, but to anticipate humiliation more than death. In drafty gymnasiums converted into indoctrination halls, with chalk dust hanging thick in the air and the smell of old floorboards beneath their knees, they had been told stories of what happened to women who surrendered. Their instructors spoke carefully, with a calm cruelty that slipped like a blade beneath the skin. They said Americans were animals, that they treated female prisoners like trophies, that the lucky ones disappeared, and the unlucky ones lived long enough to regret it. Those words had not faded with their capture. They had only learned to sleep beneath the surface. So when the dog pressed his head more firmly against one woman's ankle, she felt her chest tighten, not from comfort, but from confusion so sharp it hurt. Trust in her world was an extinct reflex. In training camps pushed into the hills beyond Osaka, they learned the Bushido Code not as philosophy, but as an ultimatum. Surrender was a stain that could not be washed. Capture was not survival, it was moral decay. They were told that even in death, honor must come first. And if capture was unavoidable, they were expected to make their bodies unuseful, broken, unreliable, almost gone before the enemy ever touched them. Some had memorized those instructions like prayers. One of them, the quiet one with the scar across her wrist, remembered standing in a line of young women while a sergeant paced before them, boots echoing sharply against stone floors. He had asked them what they feared more, starving or shame. The wrong answers were corrected with cold silence or sudden slaps. The right answer was shame, always shame. Hunger passed, pain faded. Shame lived inside the blood. So when the cowboy called her ma'am without irony as he passed her a plate later that evening, her hands trembled harder than they ever had under a rifle. Ma'am, not a slur, not a number, not an object. She tasted the word like something forbidden. Their evenings on the ranch grew colder, the Texas wind creeping through the cracks of the bunkhouse like fingers searching for bone. And still the dog came. Still he lay at their feet, eyes half closed, the steady rhythm of his breathing a soft defiance against everything they had been told about enemies and animals and distance. Each time he settled near them, their thoughts returned not to this place, but to where they had come from. To the narrow training barracks, wooden bunks lined so closely their elbows touched in sleep. To the mornings where rice portions shrank each week while the speeches grew louder. To the air raid drills where sirens howled like wounded ghosts, and the instructors shouted that fear was weakness, but surrender was worse. And most of all, to the faces that never made it. Every woman here carried at least one ghost, a brother who never returned, a nurse who stayed behind in Manila, a friend who stepped on rubble that had once been a staircase. Their survival was not something celebrated among them. It was examined, like an injury that never stopped bleeding. Why us? Why not her? Why us when others burned? So when they ate beef stew under American watch, when bread arrived warm instead of hard, when the men spoke in steady, unraised tones, a deeper pain followed. Gratitude was humiliating when remembered against starvation at home. Comfort felt like betrayal when imagined against entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Even the dog, even Buddy, became part of that war inside. They could not help what he made them feel, how he unwound their tension simply by existing, how his body leaned against theirs without any knowledge of borders, politics, or ideology. Yet each tail wag felt like a question they weren't ready to answer. If he could trust them, if he chose them simply because they were there and alive and breathing, what did that mean about everything they had been told? One night, when the ranch had gone quiet and only the whistle of wind against dry grass remained, one of the women whispered into the darkness, voice barely louder than breath. She said an American word she had heard once during transit. "Pet." It sounded childish, small. No one responded. But moments later, a hand slowly lowered onto the dog's back. Not grabbing, not claiming, just resting there, fingers sinking into warm fur. Buddy did not move. He did not flinch. He continued breathing, steady and alive. And in that stillness, between fear and disbelief, between their training and their reality, something inside them began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but like ice cracking under slow, desperate pressure. They felt the crack widening the next morning when a voice rasped across the yard with a drawl thick as syrup and slow as honey. "You girls ever shelled beans before?" The question wasn't cruel. It wasn't even mocking. It floated across the space like dust on the wind, landing gently, confusingly. The man who spoke it was older than the others, broad-shouldered, sun-darkened, with creases in his face so deep they could hold water. He wore denim from collar to boot, his hat sweat-stained at the brim. His name was Royce, and they would later agree his hands looked more like bark than skin, and his voice sounded like gravel rolling over itself in dry heat. He didn't wait for an answer, just motioned toward a bench near the open-air shed where a sack of beans waited. He showed them with a practiced twist how to pop the shell, flick the contents into a bucket, and toss the rest aside. The women followed silently. They had shelled many things, peas, nuts, even rice husks by hand when the mills had stopped running, but never like this. Never with silence, never with calm. never with a man beside them who didn't bark orders or watch them like they might run. Royce didn't ask for speed. He didn't measure efficiency. He just sat, elbow on his knee, hands moving slow and steady, like he had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. He told them which beans to keep and which to throw. He told them how to salt pork so the flies wouldn't swarm. He pointed at the sky when it clouded, said, "Storm's comin'," then went back to work. It was the quiet that got to them first. No lectures, no slogans, no guards walking back and forth like ticking clocks. Just the scrape of wood, the split of husks, the smell of dust and sweat, and something cooking in the distance. Occasionally, someone would ask for water, and it was given. No delay, no suspicion. Just a nod and a cup from a tin kettle near the shed. At first, the women glanced toward the guards every few minutes, expecting them to change tone, to turn. But the guards didn't interfere. They leaned against the porch rail, spoke to each other in low voices, sometimes smoked. Once, one of them laughed. Not at the women, just laughed. Some story, some joke. And that sound, light and natural, felt more alien than anything. Royce didn't treat them like prisoners. He didn't treat them like women. He treated them like labor. Not a compliment, but not cruelty either. In his eyes, they were hands that worked. Shellers of beans, salters of meat, carriers of buckets. Useful, capable, not symbols, not enemies. At mealtime, Royce stood at the end of the long table, hat in hand, head bowed. "Lord, bless this food. May we be grateful for the work and the hands that made it." The women stared at him. None of their own officers had ever thanked them. None had prayed over boiled cabbage, and yet here stood a man thanking heaven for the work of people he didn't know, who didn't belong, who wore the wrong flag. And then there was the dog. Buddy never left them, not during work, not during meals, not during rest. If they moved across the yard, he followed. If they stopped under shade, he lay down beside them. When one of the women dropped a tin plate and startled, Buddy rose to stand between her and the guard who turned to look. The guard waved him off with a chuckle. "Ain't no trouble, boy." But the message was clear. The dog had chosen. Royce noticed. Everyone did, but he never shooed the animal. One evening, when the sun hung low and the sky turned the color of dried peaches, Buddy curled at the feet of a woman who had not spoken since arriving. Her hands still bore the faint scars of rope burns, interrogation or escape, no one asked. When the dog laid his chin on her knee, Royce looked over from the steps. He met her eyes, nodded once. That nod was not pity, not apology. It was a kind of approval, a silent acknowledgment that the dog knew something the rest of them didn't, and he would not get in the way of it. For the women, the gesture lodged deeper than any command. They had been assigned, ordered, reduced, and trained, but here, on this strange land with red dirt and wooden spoons and a man who thanked heaven for their hands, they were being allowed. Allowed to sit, allowed to work, allowed to be. Buddy's tail thumped against the dust. Royce kept shelling beans. And for the first time, one of the women exhaled not from exhaustion, but from something dangerously close to peace. It was the next morning when a guard approached Emmy with a folded sheet of lined paper and a pencil, as casually as if handing over rations. "You can write home," he said, voice gruff but not unkind. Emmy blinked at the paper as though it were a trick. The pencil felt heavier than it should have in her hand. She didn't move, didn't sit, just stared. The bunkhouse around her buzzed with soft sounds, dishes being dried, boots being pulled on, the flap of laundry on the line, and Buddy, always Buddy, snoring lightly at the foot of someone's cot. The paper remained blank. How do you begin a letter to a mother who buried a son in Nanking, who chews tree bark to survive winter, when the smell of cornbread lingers in your clothes? How do you confess to being warm, full, alive? Emmy sat down and pressed the paper against her thigh, the pencil hovering. "Mother," she wrote, and then nothing. The word looked too clean. The Americans had said they would censor letters. That didn't scare her. What scared her was what she might write truthfully, that she slept in a wooden bed, that she had tasted sugar, that the enemy had handed her a wool blanket in the cold and never once raised a hand. That a dog, a real dog with a name, chose to sleep beside her every night as if they shared the same blood. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what her mother's house smelled like. Rice, steam, camphor wood, ink. It had been bombed in the spring of the last year. She hadn't heard since. Maybe there was no one to write to. Across the room, another woman asked for paper, too, and another. Soon the guards had to bring more pencils. Each woman wrote differently. Some scribbled fast and furious, as if afraid the words might vanish. Others sat still for hours, chewing at the edges of their thoughts. Emmy looked around and saw the same question in all their eyes. How do we explain kindness without sounding like traitors? Because that's what it felt like. Treachery. She remembered the posters from her training camp. American soldiers with wild eyes and dripping teeth, dragging women by their hair. Now she sat on American soil, clean, unbound, eating meat stew with warm bread. At night they played harmonica tunes on the porch. She had laughed once, quietly, and clamped her hand over her mouth in shame. Emmy bent her head back over the letter. "I am safe. There is food. They do not hurt us." She paused. The sentences felt like confessions, not to the enemy, to the women who had died along the way, to her cousin who had jumped from the hospital roof rather than be captured in the Philippines, to the nurse who slit her throat with a rusted razor when the Americans stormed the beach. Those women had chosen the honorable death. Emmy had survived. What does that make her? She added another line. There is a dog here. He follows us. He sleeps near my feet. I do not understand it. She wanted to say more, that the dog made her ache in ways she didn't have words for, that his trust unmade something inside her each time he leaned his head on her lap, that Buddy's loyalty felt purer than any cause she had ever served, but she didn't write it. Instead, she folded the paper quietly, slipped it into the waiting stack to be reviewed and sent, if it ever would be. That night she lay awake and watched the dog breathe in the darkness, his ears twitching in sleep. She reached out once, hesitated, then let her fingers rest on the coarse fur at his back. He didn't stir. The war outside had quieted, but the one inside her had only just begun. It happened without warning. One moment the women were stringing beans into baskets under the slanting afternoon sun, their hands moving automatically in the rhythm that had become routine. The next, there was a soft sound, a clatter of metal, the sharp intake of breath, and then she collapsed. Her name was Aiko, thin, quieter than most, and always wrapped in layers as if the air itself bruised her skin. When she fell, the basket tipped, green beans scattering like spilled teeth in the dirt. For a second, no one moved. Reflex held them frozen, because in the old world, collapsing meant punishment. Weakness brought shame. Shame brought retribution. They had learned to stay upright even when their bodies screamed. But Royce was already on his feet before any of the women could even speak. He crouched beside Aiko, his thick hand brushing the sweat from her forehead. "Hot," he muttered, then stood up and turned to the porch. "Go get the medic." It wasn't a question, and within minutes a man in a different uniform arrived. Not one of the cowboy guards, but a soldier with a red cross stitched on his sleeve and a bag that rattled when he knelt beside Aiko's body. He didn't speak much, only checked her pulse, touched her throat, opened her eyelids. When she groaned, he nodded once and called for water. The women watched, not with fear, but with confusion. There was no violence, no scolding, no turning away. And then Buddy moved. The dog had been sprawled in the shade under the bunkhouse stairs. But as the medic leaned in, Buddy rose slowly and padded over to where Aiko lay. He did not bark, did not sniff. He simply sat beside her head and stared at the medic, unblinking, as if waiting for confirmation, as if he had appointed himself guardian of the fragile and sick. Royce didn't send him away. Later that evening, Aiko was carried inside on a stretcher of old canvas and wood. The guards brought her to a cot near the wall, away from the windows, and gave her a new blanket, thicker, darker, the kind usually reserved for army men in colder climates. The other women noticed something else, too. That night, each of their beds held a second blanket folded at the foot. Quietly, without explanation, not just for the sick, for all of them. And Buddy? He stayed. He climbed onto the floor beside Aiko's cot, circled once, then settled into the space like he'd always known it was meant for him. Through the night, when Aiko groaned or shifted, the dog would lift his head and rest it on the mattress edge. When the wind creaked through the boards, he growled low, soft, barely audible, like a warning to something unseen. By morning, Aiko was still breathing, pale, but no longer shaking. And when she opened her eyes, her hand drifted weakly toward the fur at her side, fingers curling. Not for protection, for proof. The women whispered over breakfast, heads close, voices hushed. Did you see? He didn't leave her. Not once. Some began to speak of Buddy differently after that, not as a pet, not as a mascot, but as something older, something chosen, a protector, a watcher, maybe even a spirit in a dog's body, sent not by nation or cause, but by whatever small mercy still moved in the broken machinery of war. Royce said nothing when he passed by them that morning, just tipped his hat once and moved on, but his eyes paused on Buddy and Aiko still curled together in sleep. Whatever code governed this ranch, it did not resemble the ones they had memorized under flags and empires. It was older, wordless, measured not in punishments, but in presence. And the dog, without knowing, had become its most sacred law. They started noticing him more in the afternoons, when the heat made even the shadows sweat, and most of the younger guards leaned back in chairs or wandered off to smoke. The older soldier always stayed close to the edge of the yard, not out of duty, but out of habit, it seemed. His name was never spoken. He wore no rank that they could see. Gray hair stuck out from beneath a sweat-darkened cap, and his uniform looked softer with age, the fabric faded in patches where the sun had worn it thin. He never shouted, never scolded, never stared. Instead, he carved. With a slow, methodical motion, he would pull a small block of pine from his pocket, sit cross-legged in the dust, and begin to whittle. The blade he used was short and worn, the movements practiced, gentle flicks of the wrist, curls of pale wood falling onto his lap like dry petals. At first, the women kept their distance. Fear made them cautious. But curiosity, always stronger than fear once it had time to breathe, pulled their gazes toward him. He didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he did, and simply didn't mind. It was Amy who first dared to inch closer, casually, as if she were stretching or tying her boot. She watched his hands. They were large, but not crude. Old hands, with scars at the knuckles and fingers bent from past breaks. The kind of hands that had once held rifles, probably, but now held only wood. And then, one day, he carved a dog. It was small, no more than a few inches long, its tail curled and its ears pointed forward with the same alert softness that defined Buddy's posture when watching the fields. The body was smooth, but the paws were defined, delicate cuts suggesting motion. He finished it without ceremony, wiped the blade clean on his sleeve. Then, without looking directly at her, he held the carving out in Emmy's direction. Just once. A quiet offer. She stepped forward and took it in both hands. He didn't say a word, just nodded once, the same way Royce did. Then he went back to carving another block. Something new, maybe just whittling for whittling's sake. The other women gathered around her that evening, heads low, eyes wide. They passed the little wooden dog from hand to hand, careful not to drop it. Its surface was smooth from the oil of his palms, and when they looked at it, it was not just a carving. It was a message, not of surrender, not of forgiveness, but of recognition. That some of these men, these Americans, were not here to dominate or shame. Some, like them, were just old, just tired, just trying to carve something out of the quiet that followed the noise of war. They began to watch the older soldier more after that, how he winced when he stood, how he rubbed his knee when the cold set in, how he nodded to them when they passed, not as superiors or captives, but as people sharing the same sun, the same dust, the same air. The carving was placed on a shelf inside the bunkhouse, high where it could not fall. At night, they glanced at it before sleep, not as a god, not as a charm, but as proof. Proof that kindness could be silent, that gestures could speak when language failed, that the enemy, when seated in the sun with nothing but wood and time, might stop being an enemy at all. It came fast, a snap in the sky like a bone breaking, followed by a deep rumble that rolled through the earth beneath their feet. The storm had been circling all evening, clouds stacked like bruises over the horizon. But no one expected the lightning to hit, and when it did, it struck the barn. The flash lit up the yard like midday. A second later, a plume of smoke burst from the far side of the structure. Then fire, orange, hungry, curling up the outer wall in jagged fingers. Someone shouted, maybe Royce, maybe a guard. It didn't matter. The women moved, not because they were ordered, not because they were free, but because something ancient and human surged inside them, instinct. Before the guards could stop them, before anyone could remember what uniforms they wore, several prisoners were already running. Bare feet on sharp gravel, cloths yanked from the laundry lines, buckets snatched from the pump, shouts in broken English and urgent Japanese. "Water! Here! More!" Buddy barked madly, running between the women and the flames, circling the chain of bodies as if guiding them. The guards stood frozen for a breath, unsure if this was an escape or something else. Then one of them shouted, "Let 'em go!" And the tension shattered. A chain formed, women and guards, side by side, passing sloshing buckets toward the blaze. Steam hissed as water met flame. The barn crackled like paper, sparks rising into the storm-heavy sky. One of the beams groaned and collapsed inward. Smoke blurred vision. Coughs cut through the dark. But they didn't stop. There were no titles, no ranks, just hands and breath and movement. A woman who once crawled through mud to avoid being seen now stood shoulder to shoulder with the same man who had taken her name at the gate. They passed buckets without speaking, without looking too long. But each gesture said what words never could. This moment is not war. This moment is survival. When the flames finally gave up, smothered, drowned, defeated, the yard fell into silence. Only the soft drip of water from scorched beams, the occasional cough, the shivering breath of someone too close to the heat. Royce stood in the doorway, his shirt dark with sweat and smoke. He looked over the women, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes raw. Then he said simply, "Good work." That was all. But it was everything. Not a speech, not a sermon, just acknowledgement. Honest and clean. And somehow it meant more than any medal. The women didn't cheer, they didn't cry. They just stood there, still breathing, still alive. Buddy trotted over and leaned his wet nose against Emmy's leg, his flank smudged with ash. She scratched behind his ear without thinking. Later, when they returned to the bunkhouse, the smoke clinging to their skin like memory. No one spoke of orders or permissions. They lay in silence, exhausted, but lighter. The air between them had shifted. Something had been burned away, not just wood, not just fear, but the invisible line that had divided us and them, because in that hour there had been no them, only hands, only sweat, only fire, and trust, not the kind printed in manuals or demanded by flags, but the kind born in urgency, in sweat-stung eyes meeting across smoke, in shared risk, in silent agreement. Tomorrow they would be prisoners again. Guards would resume their posts. Fences would still stand. But for one night, the fire had melted more than timber. It had scorched away the last remnants of what they thought they were allowed to feel. And what was left, smoldering and bare, was something dangerously close to respect. It started quietly. Buddy didn't rise when the breakfast bell rang. No tail thump, no half-limp trot toward the fire pit. At first, they thought he was just tired, maybe sore from pacing during the storm, but by midday he still hadn't moved from beneath the bunkhouse steps. His eyes stayed half-lidded. His breathing was slow. When Emmy brought him a crust of cornbread, he sniffed once and turned his head away. Something cracked open in the silence that followed. One of the women whispered, "He's sick." Another knelt and touched his fur. "Hot." A third, barely audible. "Too hot." Panic came not with screams, but with the sudden rush of action. They fetched Royce, the guards, the medic, anyone. They didn't ask permission, they pleaded. Their words tangled in fear, in accents, in shaking hands. "Please," they said, "please help him." They had known hunger, had seen death, had buried friends in shallow jungle graves, but this, the thought of losing Buddy, made their voices break in a new way. He was not just a dog, he had become something else. A tether to their sanity, a bridge they never meant to cross but now could not live without. His presence had been their shadow, their sentinel. If he vanished, what would remain? Royce didn't hesitate. "Call the vet," he said, voice firm. The women sat with Buddy while they waited, stroked his fur, cooled his paws with damp cloths. They didn't speak much, but their faces carried the grief of people preparing to mourn a comrade. Not a mascot, not a pet, but someone who had stood beside them in fire, in fear, in silence. When the veterinarian arrived, a woman with silver glasses and calm hands, she knelt down, examined him, listened to his heart. "Dehydrated," she said. "Fever. Could be something he picked up from a tick. I'll give him a shot. He'll need rest." They watched her like acolytes watching a priest. That night, the bunkhouse was quieter than usual. They kept the door open. One by one, the women took turns checking on him, leaving scraps, whispering things they couldn't say aloud to anyone else. And when he finally drank, just a few laps from the tin bowl, the relief was so deep it felt like prayer. But the next morning, something had shifted, because they had loved him, truly loved him, and in that love, something in them broke and didn't repair in the same shape. This was not the loyalty of flag or command, It was not obedience to training or survival. It was raw, wordless attachment, love in its oldest and simplest form. For an American dog, for something born from the land of their captors, something that wagged its tail at enemy hands and licked the faces of women who once believed they'd be bayoneted on sight. That love made them ache, not with guilt, but with confusion, with loss, with the quiet death of something they hadn't realized was still alive inside them, the boundary between who they were and who they were allowed to become. When Buddy stood again, slow but steady, the cheers were whispered. One woman kissed his head, another wept openly into her hands. And in the silence that followed, a question took root, not spoken aloud, but blooming in the space between heartbeats. If love could live here, what else had they been wrong about? If you've been moved by this story so far, give it a like and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear. The answer came on a blistering afternoon, folded neatly into a faded envelope and handed over without ceremony. Emmy had been feeding chickens behind the bunkhouse when the guard approached, his expression unreadable. "You got one," he muttered, placing the letter into her hand before walking off. She stood frozen, eyes locked on the return address in the corner, the shape of her sister's handwriting bleeding through thin, war-worn paper. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled. The sun above dimmed into irrelevance as everything around her disappeared into the small rectangle of hope. She didn't open it right away. For several minutes she held it against her chest, as though afraid the words might vanish if she looked too soon. That envelope had crossed a chasm she thought uncrossable. Oceans, censers, and ruins. And inside, maybe, was everything she had longed for and feared in equal measure. When she finally unfolded the letter, her eyes fell instantly on the first line. "I am alive." The words struck like wind after drought. Too much, too sudden, too real. Her knees weakened. She sank to the wooden step beside the bunkhouse, pressing the page close to her face as tears blurred the ink. Her sister was alive, still breathing in the ruins of their hometown, still planting what little could grow, still boiling water for tea, but not untouched. The house had burned. Their mother was gone. The neighbors scavenged for rice husks. Yet, despite it all, her sister had survived. And then came the sentence that tore something loose inside Emmy's chest. "If the enemy has given you food, then live. If the dog protects you, then let it." She read it 3 times. The first time in disbelief, the second in confusion, the third with quiet devastation. Her sister wasn't condemning her. She was releasing her. There, in the middle of a world she no longer understood, her sister had offered permission, not to surrender, but to remain. Not to forget, but to breathe. Survival, the letter said, could be sacred, too. Until that moment, Emmy had wrapped herself in a cloak of guilt. Each bite of bread, each moment of safety under a foreign roof had pressed against her ribs like betrayal. But here was her sister, writing from hunger, writing from grief, telling her to live, to let the dog guard her, to let kindness, even from enemies, hold meaning. She passed the letter around the bunkhouse. One by one, the women read it in silence, fingers brushing against the edge as if it were a holy relic. Their expressions changed. Something softened, something surrendered. No longer to the Americans, but to the truth that had been forming quietly inside them for months, that their survival was not a stain. They spoke of home that night, not as it had been bombed, not as it had fallen, but as it had lived, of plum blossoms in spring, of laughter in the rice paddies, of paper lanterns drifting in warm twilight. The guilt did not disappear, but it transformed. It became a thread they could follow, not backward toward regret, but forward toward meaning. Buddy curled at Emmy's feet as she reread the last line of her sister's letter by moonlight. He blinked up at her, unaware of the role he had played in a war beyond bullets. She scratched behind his ears, tears drying on her cheeks. This was not surrender. This was not treason. This was healing. And for the first time since captivity, she believed she might deserve it. If this moment moved you, tap like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear. It arrived with no ceremony, no trumpets, no cheers, just the low, dusty rumble of the same olive-green truck that had brought them here what felt like a lifetime ago. The gate swung open, the tires ground over gravel, and the order came down like a whisper through the compound. They were going home. Home. The word landed like an echo, hollow and uncertain. For hours they packed in silence. One bundle of folded clothes, one bundle of letters, the carved wooden dog, a few pencils, everything they had not arrived with but now could not imagine leaving behind. No one spoke of celebration. No one said goodbye to the guards. Even Royce just tipped his hat and nodded once when the first woman passed by. They had become used to his language of silences. It said enough, but it was Buddy who broke them. The dog sensed the change before they did. He paced the yard as they loaded onto the truck, his ears flicking, his body restless. When the final woman stepped onto the tailgate, Buddy whined. Not loudly, not for show. It was the sound of something pulled loose. Then, without hesitation, he ran. His paws pounded over the packed earth as he charged the truck. He leapt up, placing his front paws on the edge, tongue out, eyes bright. It was not desperation. It was a goodbye with weight. One of the women, Yuki, reached out before she could stop herself. Her fingers brushed the fur between his ears. Buddy licked her hand once, gently, then dropped back to the ground. He didn't bark. He didn't chase the truck when it rolled forward. He just stood there, eyes locked on them as they drove away. Watching, not like a sentry guarding prisoners, but like a friend seeing someone off on a long road. The women wept quietly, not for captivity, not even for what they were returning to, but for the strange ache of leaving the only being who had never needed to forgive them, because he had never judged them to begin with. As the ranch disappeared behind them, the world grew wide again. Roads twisted through country they had only imagined, towns dotted the horizon. But none of it felt real. Their uniforms still marked them. Their accents, their faces, still said enemy. They were free, technically. But freedom now felt like something that had to be learned again, like walking after months of being still. Inside the truck, Emmy clutched her sister's letter. Yuki ran her thumb along the carved wooden dog, now worn smooth from being passed hand to hand. The air was heavy, not with fear, but with the strange weight of becoming someone new, of leaving behind not just fences, but the version of themselves who had arrived behind them. Because captivity had ended, yes, but something else had taken root, something born in silence, in firelight, in the soft thud of a dog sleeping at your feet. They had been prisoners, but not only that, they had become people again, slowly, quietly, through the smallest kindnesses. And now, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, and the truck carried them toward a future they could not yet see, each woman carried something that would never be listed in a ledger or recorded in a file. They carried the memory of a place where mercy came in the form of a nod, where fire had made them equal, where a dog, born of the enemy's land, had guarded them without being told. They had come here expecting cruelty. They left knowing love. And part of them would always remain beneath that wide sky, where the dust curled beneath Buddy's feet and the silence had spoken louder than war ever could. If this story stayed with you, give it a thumbs up and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read everyone.